Good morning.
Good morning.
Shirt representing.
Hmm?
What is the shirt representing?
Oh, it's a band, Alt-J. Alt-Rock band? This is a SAR images of like a river delta, satellite image of a river delta.
Which? Alt J, did they write brief blocks?
Yes, these blocks. Not these blocks. Okay, everyone. It's 11:30, and I think I'll start right now. So today, Dr. Eick is still in Germany, so he'll be back next Monday, I think. So till then, you have me. So what are you going to do today? I'll be giving you guys a very brief primer to deep learning, machine learning, AI, like what's it all about? Like what are the fundamental differences between them? Just a very brief primer. I'm not going into too much in depth into like the math of it or anything like that. Then I'll be giving you guys a very good brief, but like somewhat in-depth look into autoencoders and variational autoencoders and why we need like this particular version of autoencoders called variational autoencoders. Autoencoders are very useful, and they're essentially your task 5 is autoencoders. For task 5, we'll be giving you like the entire code base for all of that. So all you need to do is in Python, just put in how the model is supposed to look like, and then work out what your display results are supposed to look like. So you don't have to do a lot of work for task 5, but you need to understand what autoencoders are for that. Okay, so let's start with that. Yes, task 5 is Python only. I'll be giving you Python code. Like I'll be giving you a notebook that you can use for task 5 fully. So it's a working code, but it's I'm sorry, but for this kind of task, for like machine learning, autoencoder stuff, you can use R, but it's kind of hard. It's easier if you use like direct raw C++, but for now, Python is way. So this image is actually pretty old. It's from 2015, 2016. NVIDIA made it. A lot of like deep learning libraries that you'll use, that you'll find that like the code that's available, you'll find that they are fine-tuned for NVIDIA, because NVIDIA cornered the market kind of for like deep learning tensor cores and RT and all kinds of like hardware-based machine learning is especially for people like us who are not working on supercomputers with like millions of gigatransfers per second. For our purpose, NVIDIA is essentially the be-all and end-all, or you are running directly on your CPU. But I recommend running it on NVIDIA tensor cores or CUDA cores or whatever. So AI as a concept is actually pretty old. Right? I mean, the fundamental concepts of AI are from like Leibniz. So like from the late 1600s and early 1700s. Obviously, they didn't really understand neurons or anything like that. But the math for very early AI came from like I said, Leibniz in the 1600s. Well, the AI that we know of today, essentially the neurons that you have learned in class, came from the 1950s. DoD worked on it, ARPANET worked on it, some groups from Europe worked on it, some groups from Japan worked on it. But at that time, we didn't really have enough raw computational power to deploy what we know as artificial intelligence today. But the theory behind what could be done in the future obviously came from the 50s. A lot of it came from like science fiction writers as well, like on what they get about. After the 50s, from the 80s, came like a further understanding of machine learning, essentially combined statistical models, which like dominated all kinds of predictions, like whether it's stock market predictions or weather. Everything relied on very, very, very large and powerful statistical models. Well, inference learning and like training models to understand human intuition came from the 80s. And today, obviously, a lot more architectures have been developed over the last 20 years or so. Like since I'll say the late 90s, when Jan LeCun started like working on like deep neural networks and stuff. Well, after that came deep learning, what we have today. Essentially, the fundamentals of what we call deep learning is pretty much 20 years old. Like before 2010, before 2009, we didn't really have like convolutional neural networks, recurrent neural networks. We didn't really have it that way. But well, these are essentially, they were built on top of these things, right? So once we had like basic machine learning, we came up with like new versions of basic machine learning, and we came up with deep learning. Think of it as if you have learned physics, think of it as like a special theory of relativity and then a general theory of relativity. So we are generalizing the task, making it more useful in not just like very hardcore physics simulations or stock predictions, but for everything. Recognizing yourself on Facebook pictures or recognizing, I don't know, cats and dogs or whatever. Essentially, we are generalizing math. The link up on top, the deep dive link up on top. If you, once I share the slides to you, you'll find that it goes into very in depth of like the historical basis for how like modern deep learning came to be. So, okay, cool. So, what is the artificial intelligence? What is machine learning? What is deep learning? So, like I said, hang on. Give me a second. So artificial intelligence is essentially the ability of a computer to perform tasks commonly associated with human beings. So, okay, AI is not something we have to, no matter what GPT or Bard or anyone tells you, but this is a goal, eventual goal, that like a computer would be able to solve essentially the Turing test completely. That is, if instead of me, a computer was standing here and teaching you, you would not be able to tell the difference between me and a computer who's teaching you. I mean, you might not be able to tell the difference now anyway, but that's more of a slight on my intelligence rather than general artificial intelligence. So what is machine learning in contrast? Machine learning is the study of algorithms that learn from examples and experience instead of relying on hard-coded rules and then make predictions on new data. So it is essentially a very fancy statistical model. That's all there is to it. So you take statistical models, you layer them on top of each other until the layers have become so complicated that you don't really know what's going on in between, and you have a machine learning model. It's simplified and it's somewhat reductive, but that's what it is. Now, deep learning focuses on learning data representations and in layers of meaningful data. So what deep learning does not do is that it doesn't essentially it doesn't build statistical models that predict every step of what's going on. Right. Deep learning identifies patterns. Humans are very good at identifying patterns. Machines are not. But with deep learning, we are getting closer and closer to human level understanding of patterns. Now, patterns emerge in all sorts of things, whether it's like whether it's like just looking at me and you're able to immediately distinguish between like this whiteboard and the wall and me, and this is all like pattern recognition. Your brain is like an extremely powerful model that is able to recognize, differentiate between us and between various different things. So essentially what deep learning does is this. It guesses at patterns. Now, how does it do that? It's kind of hard to tell. Once deep learning networks and the interconnections between models, it's an entire field of study to understand how a deep learning black box is working. But in our case, we don't really need to know how it's working. What we need to know is how accurate is it and what is it giving us, right? So, one more interesting part of this is you'll find that some names, these are like the very most important papers in modern deep learning history, right? Like all the way to 2017, Google Transformers. So this is a very fundamental paper in modern deep learning. It's called Catch and Forget. It's the paper that introduced something called transformers. And transformers are essentially what, I mean, a lot of you have been using ChatGPT or Google Bard or any of these text generators, right? Transformers is what made them possible, essentially. So, like I said, you find that names like Jeff Hinton, Jan LeCun, and these names will come up over and over again. So they are like the pioneers of like modern deep learning. Essentially, they introduced dropout mechanism, deep residual learning, generate representative networks, which people use for generating, all sorts of. These days, people are using it for generating paintings, etc., etc. So all of that is coming. All of these are like super new tech. So you have to be kind of like if you want to be on the cutting edge of it, you have to keep looking at papers published by some of these people. Like always look at papers published by Goodfellow or LeCun or Jeffrey Hinton or things like that. So, like I said, the most important paper here right now is the transformer paper. Attention is all you need. That paper introduced a transformer architecture, which is really good for essentially natural language processing, NLP tasks. So let's go a little bit more in depth into machine learning versus deep learning. Well, for conventional machine learning methods are trained by, they have a lot of human training required. Like you need to do a lot of manual image classification and retraining and giving out like identifying errors, etc., etc. Like classical machine learning requires a lot of it requires a lot of human labor at the start of it. It works very well afterwards, but it requires a lot of human labor to start. And also, it's very difficult to generalize a machine learning model, right? Machine learning models are highly specific. They're very powerful within their domain, but outside of that domain, they're not very good. A good example of this is if you work with satellites, is star sensors. Star sensors of satellites are what like small sats or any other kind of satellites that are outside of Earth and they don't have a lat long or a GPS to know where they are. Star sensors help them identify where they are based on the location and position of essentially stars in the sky. That is a very difficult thing to do. But humans have been doing it for ages. I know people have been traveling over vast distances over oceans just by looking at stars. In the 70s and 80s, NASA developed very powerful statistical models for to solve this problem, like star sensor problem, where their satellites, especially satellites that are going into like deep space, like Voyager, anything like that. They were relying on like these very powerful but very big statistical models to identify where they are if humans on the ground couldn't help them. Modern machine learning made that an extremely trivial task. Now, instead of needing NASA supercomputers to train their star sensors, any small sat, any microsat that you want to send up into space has a more powerful star sensor architecture than anything since the 1990s. Right. So again, a fairly complicated task, but it became like trivially solved problem just by a very powerful and complicated machine learning. So what does this look like on an architecture level, like machine learning versus deep learning? So you see that in a deep learning model, you combine all the interior parts of a machine learning model into one. So essentially, the feature extraction is identifying what's in the image, like all the different parts of the image, like whether they're different colors in case of an image, or if you're training it on like audio, all the different signals in an audio, all of those are features in your input data. So in a standard machine learning model, you need to perform feature extraction because if you don't submit the features separately to the model, it keeps training itself on garbage, and your output will in the end doesn't really make sense, right? So a problem where that machine learning solved using feature extraction and classification is noise reduction. So if you're talking on your, if you're chatting on any kind of VoIP service, whether it's Discord or Skype, I don't know if Skype does it, Discord or Teams or whatever, the noise gets automatically reduced when you're talking. Like some of them, not always, and that noise reduction is done by again pretty powerful machine learning. These days they've probably already switched to like more general deep learning methods, but when it started, it was done through machine learning models just to recognize human voice versus noise, and then cut out noise and perform complete noise reduction. Sure, go ahead. Yeah, deep learning tends to learn a different form.
Deep learning is less
What?
less data because it's redoing everything.
Yes, yes. Machine learning in general, okay. So in general, if you're training on the exact same data, deep learning will require more of it versus machine learning. Machine learning, like in a full deep learning model, you don't really know what features it's extracting, right? You have no idea. So if you give it more data, the more accurately it will extract those features from within, whatever like black magic it's doing inside. Yeah. So why deep learning? So deep learning is, like I said, it's more flexible, more generalized, and it works across media. It works for visual media, image classification, like you'll see in Facebook, text, that is text generation, like you see in ChatGPT or Bard or whatever, and linguistic information. DeepL is, for example, one of the world's most powerful translators. Though probably these days Bard has gone past it, but like translating between different languages is again, like if you have a large corpus of text to train on, deep learning translation methods are probably more powerful or as powerful as a human translator. So obviously a human translator can understand nuance better than a deep learning method. But in volume of text, obviously a deep learning method is a little more powerful. Deep learning is more effective end-to-end. So what does that mean? End-to-end means that you don't need to worry about, like the end user, the customer doesn't need to worry about what model you're using, what are the features that need to be used, what kind of hardware you need. None of that is necessary. So modern deep learning is, for example, your cell phones. If you have an iPhone, they have like fairly powerful deep learning tools built into it for like all sorts of purposes, for like clearing out your images, for detecting spam, for virus detection, security purposes, cryptography, and like so for all these purposes, the end user does not need to worry about any of this, what's happening in the background. So deep learning is, it encompasses the entire spectrum of taking in data, getting the good results, etc., etc. Like you said, requires a lot of training data, right? And these days, since about 2010, like I said, deep learning performance has grown like exponentially. Right. Initially, the first deep learning methods went into CNNs and RNNs, so neural networks, where we were using it to classify images for medical purposes, for physics, and for all sorts of things. And then now it has like grown to encompass everything essentially. If you're working online on any kind of tech, it is probably using some form of deep learning background. So for vision, then speech, then natural language processing, and now it's on everything. So again, just to reframe what we just discussed, we take a picture of a cat in a traditional machine learning. We handcraft the features. So we tell them, okay, that's a white cloud, that's a cat, that's a cluster cloud. Those are roses. So we put in those features into the model. It learns those features and then when you give it a new picture, it'll be able to more easily identify all these things. For a deep learning method, you don't give it anything. What it will do is it won't use more than one picture, basically. But it will learn all these things on its own, essentially. So yeah, I have a lot of cat pictures in this slide in this presentation. So just warning you right now.
Sounds great. So you're initially feeding images to a deep learning thing. Do you need to tell it like this is a picture of a cat, associate all similar pictures with cat? Like,
Oh
how
no,
does
it depends, but it generally tends to learn all of this on its own. So it doesn't really know what a cat is. It just knows that this particular group of pixels are similar to another group of pixels.
But it takes a human at some point saying. "This picture
Yes,
is a cat."
yes. In the end, obviously, once you get the results, human tells the model that these are cats or whatever. Yeah.
Right.
So you think of it like unsupervised classification, right? It guesses things. So, yes. Yeah, we need to tell them, okay, this is a cat, this is a thing. But in deep learning, you need more pictures, but you will guess like what's like these cat-like objects are probably cats. So that's what like in a deep learning thing, you don't need to tell it any of these things like okay, this part is a cat. You understand the concept. Obviously, like I said, you won't understand this from one picture. It will take way more pictures than traditional machine learning, but it will be way more accurate. Okay, so now we are seeing that okay, it's working very well. So obviously this isn't like perfect, right? If deep learning was perfect, then we'd already have generalized AI and it would already go Skynet. So what are the problems? And like obviously the biggest problem we have is called the no free lunch theorem. So it came from like originally statistical classifiers and supervised learning. It means that one model cannot classify every single problem in this space. Right. Even today, even like I said, a deep learning model is super general, but a deep learning model like you say BERT or ChatGPT, which have billions of parameters in them. Even that is not as good as like a very basic machine learning model that does image classification. Like you can train on your laptops a CNN based image classifier that will perform better than ChatGPT or BARD in image classification, because those models, as powerful or as general as they are not the best for image classification. Right. So how do we solve that? We need to make like lots of assumptions about these things. So that's why when Google uses or OpenAI, when they develop things like DALL-E, DALL-E is a model that if you give it some text, it will generate some images for you, right? So, but again, these are two different domains. So how does it do that? In the background, it does a lot of assumptions. So it takes the text that you put in and it generalizes that into a bunch of like different vectors, and those vectors each represent a particular concept in an image generation, a generative adversarial network model, and using those concepts it generates an image, right? And I always tell people, like, if you are doing whatever domain you're going in, unless you're doing like raw machine learning research, the no free lunch theorem will apply to no matter what domain you're going into. If you take an astronomy model for identifying, I don't know, supernovas, and then you put it in directly into identifying cancer cells in an MRI image, it won't work well. And honestly, it'll probably work worse than like a basic statistical model or a basic human being looking into it. So you can't like no free lunch means you can't really avoid this stuff, right? If you can come up with a perfect generalized AI, you'll probably get the Nobel Prize or you'll probably be killed by a robot. So, okay, now another problem. Good problems to have. So another major problem is pattern recognition. A deep learning model or a machine learning model is able to easily recognize, you give it a picture of a cat, and then that cat is in like various different positions. The machine learning model and the deep learning model will recognize them, right? Easily. You give it a cat wearing glasses, a machine learning model probably won't be able to recognize it because the features wearing glasses and wearing a month's habit, those are not associated with pictures of a cat. A deep learning model might be able to guess it, right? Because for a deep learning model, it doesn't distinguish between like whether something is behaving like a cat or whatever. It just looks at like how similar these things are, and once it looks at the pixel and the face or whatever, it might be able to guess. Now you go further into like absurdity. Like, look at these pictures of rats. That's as a punk and that's as a god. Now, these are way far away from the initial understanding of what a rat looks like for any kind of model to understand what's going on. Like modern deep learning models, some of them might be able to guess, but it won't be able to understand like what, it won't be able to give you context. Like it might be able to guess that like, okay, this part of like 50% of this picture represents a rat, but it won't be able to tell you what the rest of it is, right? But a human, you don't have to think much. Like you look at this image and you can tell that this is like a punk rat and a golf rat, right? So you don't have to like. There's no long processing time going on in your brain thinking about what's going on. But for a deep learning model, again, I'm giving you this because I tested this on a couple of different models. A lot of them were able to, like I said, guess like the top part of the picture is a rat. But again, the rest of this picture went unclassified. Even the humans are able to solve it instantly. So again, this kind of pattern recognition is a hard problem, and it's still being solved. So if you are going into research, again, problems like this, like multi-domain image classification is a good solution. Okay. So after this, we are going into more technical stuff. So let's start by looking at when we are training machine learning or deep learning models, what does the data look like? Tensors. Tensors are what data look like. So what are tensors? Tensors are a 1D tensor is essentially a vector. It's a list. It's a list or an array or whatever you call it. That's a one-dimensional tensor. A two-dimensional tensor is a vector. It's a matrix, right? A matrix or a determinant or whatever you call it. And then you move on into 3D, 4D, 5D tensors, where you're adding in more dimensions into those images. So like, if you want to think of it more intuitively, think of it like an ultraviolet image, right? Like if your camera is able to take ultraviolet photos, so the first layer of the photo would be like what you normally see, right, in normal colors. In a second layer would be those same pixels, but with ultraviolet values, right? So that is representing like two different, like a 3D tensor essentially. So one matrix of images, which is just like your RGB values, and then another one that is like UV values essentially. If you have data like this in Python, it's usually stored as numpy or arrays. These are implemented in the background in Python in C++ to make them like fairly efficient and extremely fast. Because otherwise, because these deep learning models, these tensors can get up to like humongous sizes, we use ND arrays just to multi-thread them just to make their processing way easy. And there are like lots of algorithms to deal with like tensor math. If you're using an NVIDIA card, they have special tensor cores just to handle the math behind all these tensors. So for training a model, you have all done the training, validation, and testing stage. But one thing that we end up doing, especially for images, is adversarial testing. what adversarial testing does is that in a lot of like image classification tasks, because we don't really know how the deep learning model is learning these features, you can put in noise values in those images, and suddenly your classification would be completely wrong. Right. So this has been used both for good and for bad. For example, in the 2015, in around 2014 or 2015, there was a research task with like juggalo faces, black and white markings on their faces, juggalos. I don't know if juggalos are really even popular these days, but like think of clown faces, right? Because of how the colors were distributed on faces of clowns, facial recognition tech uh, like they work at adversarial examples in a facial recognition test. Another major problem where it's not exactly adversarial is that early facial recognition, all the models were generally trained on Western faces. So when they were implemented in countries other than Western countries, they faced problems because the facial features, because they got overtrained on Western features, they were unable to accurately identify non-Western people. So and when training, so what we do is we turn them into batches, right? So we take small sets of input data which are as variable as possible, and then we process them independently so that the errors in one batch does not amplify errors in other batches. So you create batches of like all different kinds of people at the same time. So you sample them so that each batch doesn't have to be like completely representative of the entire data set, but there is variation within each batch, and then you train it as such. So once you have data like this, what does a very basic deep neural network look like? Okay. So this is what it looks like. I'll go into more detail in the next few slides. So first you have the inputs, then you layer that data, then you have targets, your predictions, like general, it will predict like yes and no or whatever. Then you have a loss function that checks how accurate your model is getting. Then once you have that loss score, you back propagate it to an optimizer. So what the optimizer does is it figures out how best to use that loss score to improve the weights of the deep learning model. And then once you have those updated weights, you feed it back into all the internal layers of the deep neural net. So you look at, there is no feature classification layer in here that like what you would have in a standard machine learning model, right? So there are you'll see in task 5 there are lots of different data processing modules. Like there are dense interactive modules, convolutional, which is CNNs, convolutional neural network models, recurrent neural networks, and then you can do pooling, you can do flattening, merging, normalization, all of this. I'm not going into detail because this is like an entire course on its own, but I'm just telling you like these are the names that you'll find, right? So the input layer is usually one or more tensor, depending on whether you're using NVIDIA or not. And they have a state, which of the values have a state, which are the weights. Initially, you can initialize them in many different ways, but generally for a deep learning model, because of how large these tensors are, they're randomly initialized, right? Well, if you are using sequential deep learning models, where the output of one model is fed into the other, there the weights of the first model gets initialized into the weights of the second model. So once these things are combined, it forms a network. What is like, so the input to the target, right? Again, cat pixels. So the network, this entire complicated network, it maps the input data tensors X to your predictions, right? And so when we are training the model, those predictions Y prime are compared to the true targets. That is what the actual targets should be. That's Y. using the loss function. So what is the loss function? There are billions and millions of loss functions. If you go to Google Scholar and search for it, you'll find new loss functions targeted towards different domains coming up like every few months or so. I personally came up with 2 different loss functions for a paper which performed terribly, so we never published the paper, but we did come up with some. So essentially what the loss function does is it finds the whatever quantity, whatever the optimized, whatever the result that you want from your model is the thing that the thing that the loss function cares about. And finally, what the model cares about might not be all the things that you care about, right? So the model might just care about like accurate classification, but you might also want to know like percentage of accuracy or other features based on like other outputs, like other things in the model might be useful to you or important to you other than just accuracy. So all those things have to be combined into your loss function, right? So the standard loss function are MSE, BC, categorical cross entropy. So mean squared error is RMSE, everyone knows root mean squared error. Cross entropy is for binary classification. Categorical cross entropy is for multi-class classification. Categorical cross entropy is actually also very useful for identifying like parts of it. So for example, you'd end up using categorical cross entropy if you are, for example, or if you have a bunch of images which are very similar but have one small feature or 2 small features that differ. This is useful in, for example, detecting cancers in images. So you'll have lots of different MRI images or X-ray images from people which are very, very similar, but very small changes in very small parts that might sometimes look different. So categorical cross entropy is one of, obviously not raw categorical cross entropy. There are way more complicated things used for this, but that's one of the functions that this is used for. Okay. So what do the optimizers do? So, well, there are lots of optimizers. So the optimizer thing. This is supposed to be a GIF. I'm not sure why it's not playing. You need to click on it. Okay. So this is what an optimizer looks like. So the star is your target. So that's where your solution needs to move. No matter how big your latent space is, you have a target solution. So like if you have a bunch of images, you know what the correct classification for all of those images should be. So the optimizer tries its hardest to train the network so that it always moves towards the target. Now, how fast it moves, whether there's hysteresis, like whether it overshoots and comes back, and finally converges. So these are all dependent upon the optimizer, right? And the learning rate and scheduling and all these are like complicated topic on its own. But what it does is it tries to figure out how quickly and how accurately it gets to a reasonable solution, right? Because even though it's working here very fast, in real life, you probably won't get anywhere near this close, right? So you probably end up using something like RMS propagation or ADAM or stochastic gradient, descent gradient, momentum. There's a lot of different factors that come into like how optimizers work. But again, you are trying to get to a target, and you're trying to figure out how to quickly and efficiently get to that target. Okay, so this has been an introduction to deep learning. Now we'll talk about what your task 5 is about, which is autoencoders. What are autoencoders? By then, what you can guess from the name is something that encodes. Essentially, an autoencoder, you can think of it as like a zip software, like as a WinZip or WinRAR or whatever. So it takes the original data and it encodes that into the model, and then it tries to reconstruct the input data as close to it as possible. So what happens is that, say, for example, you give it like you train an autoencoder on like normal images, and then you give it a blurry image, or parts of it is blurred. So when it will try to reconstruct the original image, it will remove the blur, because when it was trained originally, there were no blur in the image. So think of it that way. But again, if autoencoders were perfect, they would essentially be zips, right? But they're not perfect. They cannot be perfect. Think of it like if you're taking a photo in a DSLR, or even your iPhones have raw images, right? Raw is like very, like a lot of data would be, like every image would be like gigabytes of data if you are only storing raw images. But you don't. You store them as JPEG or PNGs or whatever. These are all lossy compression. So you take the very powerful and lots of data raw image, and then you convert it into a lossy JPEG image. If you were able to convert that lossy JPEG image into the raw image, that would be an autoencoder, essentially. Okay. So we all know that supervised learning requires labeling, classification to train a network. And then unsupervised learning, they don't need that. Unsupervised learning is more like learning, where whether it's images or word embeddings or whatever, it doesn't need to know what's in there. So it'll try to learn the distinctions in between on its own, right? So because it doesn't know any of this, so what an unsupervised learning does is it learns an embedding of the data itself. So if you train an unsupervised learning on all the data in the world, it will essentially learn a model of the world itself, so that it can reconstruct it. So that's where autoencoders come in. So you cannot identify clusters, or you cannot reduce a large text into its summary without understanding it. So if you want to understand the entirety of your data set, you need something like an autoencoder. So autoencoders are designed to reproduce their input as accurately as. So it learns, given an input, it doesn't have to be images. I'll show you what your task 5 is, which is not images. Given an input data, it learns a representation of that input data into its data space, and then it tries to reconstruct it, essentially. So it is pretty much, autoencoders are you can think of autoencoders as how humans learn. You don't, once if you're given a textbook, you don't memorize every single line and every single chapter of a textbook. You understand it, and then once you give an exam, you try to reproduce what you have understood from that book onto your exam sheets. So in that case, you are working as an autoencoder, right? Oops. So we can compare autoencoders to support vector techniques or principal component analysis, PCA and PD, which kind of does the same, right? For principal component analysis, what it does is, say for example, you have a data set with like 50 different attributes, right? 50 different columns, and you're trying to separate the clusters in between them. But with 50 different attributes, clustering or classification, it's a very complicated task. You don't know which of these attributes are going to help you the most in clustering them, right? What PCA does is it learns which of those components, which of those attributes are important, which of them are the principal components of your entire data set, and then it reduces the entire data set into one dimension where only the most important data is left, essentially. So that's what principal component analysis does, is once you perform PCA, then it becomes much easier for you to train a model on this. So you don't have to worry about 50 different attributes. You just have to worry about the PCA of it, the principal component of all these attributes. Now, the way it's done is kind of complicated, so I won't go into it. But if you have, it is kind of useful, especially if you have, for example, if you're working with census data and you have lots of different attributes of people, and you're trying to predict some target. Say you're trying to predict, I don't know, rich neighborhoods or poor neighborhoods or health or any of these indicators that are hidden somewhere in vast amounts of census data. Now PCA will help you shrink it down. So you won't know, what's the most important attributes were to identify it, but you will still be able to separate them eventually. If you have done Fourier transforms, fast Fourier transforms, or weighted impressions, PCA and SPD kind of work the same. But as comparing principal component analysis, support vector machines to autoencoders, the advantage of autoencoders is that they can learn nonlinear dependencies. Right. So nonlinear dependencies means that one attribute does not linearly depend on the other attribute. So one attribute is not just a scalar multiple of another attribute. So it might be that when one attribute, it might be a sinusoidal relationship. When one attribute goes up, the other attribute goes down, but in a more nonlinear fashion. So these in the real world that happens, because in the real world very few things are linearly related to each other. Autoencoders are really good for learning that distinction. You can use quadrilateral layers because you can use multiple different. So you can compress sets of data into. You can convolve sets of data into autoencoders. So data that is close to each other, you can link them together and you can learn the representations together. And you can transfer, you can use previous autoencoders or previous deep learning models and transfer what you have learned from them into the weights of your current autoencoder. So what does it look like? Well, obviously, it just has an encoder, latent representation, and a decoder. So this image that you see is a very popular machine learning training image. It's the MNIST database, which is essentially human-written numbers. It's similar to what we have to use to identify the numbers that you've written on your exam sheets. But some of your numbers are very hard to read. So we pass them into autoencoders and they tell us what you've written. So what the encoder does is that it compresses all those input tensors into a much smaller. It doesn't necessarily mean a smaller. It doesn't have to always be a smaller dimensional data, but it tries to convert it into a smaller, more representative data set with anything that's like unnecessarily restrictive. And what the decoder does is it reconstructs the input data from that data space. So it's essentially doing an inversion. So if you know how matrix inversion works, A inverse multiplies, gives you the identity matrix. In this case, the latent representation is the kind of like the identity matrix in this extended matrix. So you have an encoder, you have a decoder, and you have a latent representation. For your task 5, we will do everything other than the encoder and the decoder part. So all you need to do is just put in the code for the encoder and the decoder, and that'll be it. So what is it used for? Again, noise. Denoising is the perfect use case for autoencoding, right? And don't think of denoising as just this, right? Removing speckles from your images is not the only use of denoising, right? What is noise? Noise is garbage data, and garbage data can come in anything, right? Say, for example, you have a time series data of a stock market, or well, no, stock market is way too random for you. Say, for example, you have a time series data of temperature, right? Anytime the temperature spikes due to El Nino or a winter freeze like what Houston got a couple of years back, any of those data points, that's noise, right? Because that is data that wasn't there regular temperature sensitive. So looking at historical patterns of temperature data, an autoencoder can easily point out, okay, these temperature readings are outside of normal, or these seismograph readings are outside of normal. So when we talk about denoising, don't just think of like image denoising, but noise is a more fundamental part of data. And removing noise can also be, for example, anomaly detection. Like detecting anomalies in data is also a part of denoising. I'm stressing on this because your task 5 is anomaly detection. So you'll learn what to do there. So another good example of autoencoders and something that a lot of movies use for colorization of like old black and white images into modern representation, like color images, is image colorization. Like you give the input as a black and white image, and because the autoencoder has trained itself on color images, it takes a black and white image and it uh, kind of sort of goes into colors of the image. It's not perfect, as you can see. The bench turns blue. It's not a very natural color for a bench, but it tried its best. So, and finally, this is an example that is like practically used. Like you'll find online a lot of tools that does this, like remove watermarks from images that you've illegally acquired, or like a lot of images have like these large watermarks on them. So autoencoders are actually pretty good at removing this, as long as the image that the watermark that you're removing is like the image that you remove the watermark from is something that the autoencoder has trained, similar to what the autoencoder has trained on. Right. Okay, so what are the properties of autoencoders? So a big disadvantage of autoencoders is that it is only able to compress data similar to what they are trained. Like this is obvious, right? You can't train an autoencoder on like on images of people and then expect it to accurately reconstruct images of landscapes, right? So it is lossy because the decompress you lose once you compress the data, some of that information is permanently lost, right? Like lossy compression, that's what lossy compression is. You lose some of the representations of the data. You can't, there's no way around it, right? You cannot shrink something and expect that you'll get the exact original thing back, right? And another property is that it learns very well from examples, right? So autoencoders are really good at specialization. That's why you'll see that a particular type of autoencoder, I'll kind of discuss this later. They are immune to some of the problems that comes with like over specialization or overtraining or overfitting of data. Autoencoders handle that much better than other algorithms, right? One advantage of autoencoders is that the representation that it learns of the images is not understandable to us, but it is more easily understandable to machine learning models. So you can train you can use the model, you can use the latent space that an autoencoder has learned, and you can take multiple of them, and you can transfer that learning into a more broader or more general deep learning model. And that deep learning model will be way more powerful for that purpose, right? So you overtrain a model, say for example, for I've done this for like satellite images, right? So you overtrain a model on satellite images to identify, say for example, particular types of minerals in satellite data, right? You train it to identify cobalt, you train it to identify basalt, and like different types of chemicals, and that autoencoder gets really good at it. And then you transfer that learning into a more general deep learning model. And then that deep learning model will be more powerful than those autoencoders could be individually. But it is also more powerful than if we gave the entire data set to the deep learning model to learn it on its own. Okay. Now, overfitting remains a problem with autoencoders. It doesn't mean that it cannot overfit, but it is a more solvable problem for autoencoders. And the way we solve it is called the bottleneck layer, right? So the bottleneck layer essentially compresses the degrees of freedom that is available to the data set. So what happens is like a small portion of the data set, if you overfit in a large data set into a small representation, it does not take over the entire data space. Right? It does not take over your entire output. So there are some, like these are the different methods by which we solve this. We use bottleneck layers that are common to everything. We do some form of training on the data space itself to denoise it. Essentially, we auto-encode the autoencoder. We use regularization, L1 regularization usually, and we use something called a contractive penalty to penalize any kind of overfitting. So what does the bottleneck layer look like? Well, suppose there are n-cross input images and the latent space is a much smaller number of things. Then the latent space, we assume that the latent space is not sufficient to produce every single image in an n-cross n space. So we need to learn an encoding that can capture the important features in the training data, and that is sufficient for approximate reconstruction. So, that's what the bottleneck layer does, right? So a very simple bottleneck layer in Keras. Keras, PyTorch, JAX, TensorFlow. These are all Python libraries that are used for deep learning. Keras is one of them. There are differences between them, but you don't have to worry. So you give an input state of say 784, which is the initial data set. Then your encoding dimension is just 32. Then you do a dense encoding with a ReLU activation function. Then you decode it using the inverse of ReLU. You use a sigmoid activation function, decode it, and then your autoencoder takes that decoded image into and creates its essentially. So this is your bottleneck layer, and that's what you'll be creating for your task 5, essentially. So another thing we talked about is denoising autoencoders. Actually, I think I'll stop in a couple of minutes. Let me move to variational autoencoders first, so that you know that. So both I didn't talk about this, but denoising and contractive autoencoders, what the advantage of these are, the output that you get from all these different models is that they're stable, right? So if you give like 2 more images to train it, suddenly your output won't be 50% different, which is a problem with a lot of classifiers. If your training set varies very slightly, then suddenly your output like fluctuates wildly. But using contractive penalties deals with this this fluctuation. It stabilizes the output model, which is important, especially if you are deploying your model in the wild, where you don't know like what people are going to put into it. You want your model to be as stable as possible, so that if your model isn't stable, you can't really correct it. Because if you don't have a good idea of what kind of input gives you what kind of output, the stabilization penalties is a big challenge. So once the deployed autoencoder, this is what it in general looks. We don't have to worry about what NSTMs are, what long-term memories are, what current neural networks are. But in general, this is what a deployed autoencoder looks like. We were looking at like idealized autoencoders, but this is like an actual deployed autoencoder, right? So one problem with autoencoders is that it learns these embeddings, like the Z here, the Z or the Z is an embedding. Right? So all these embeddings that it learns are like hard embeddings. Like it learns that this particular image can be reconstructed in this particular way. So there are no fuzzy edges. So you don't get like percentage chances that like, okay, this once you've reconstructed this image, this is like 20% similar or 90% similar to the original image. But that is a problem, because will work, the image that you're going to get is like once you have trained the model, and then when you test it, you're not going to get the exact same model. So there'll be some amount of overlap, there'll be some amount of fuzz. Autoencoders can deal with that fuzz, but there's a particular variation of autoencoder called variational autoencoder that is designed to be very good at dealing with this kind of fuzzy behavior. So, variational autoencoder. So in variational autoencoder, the latent space that we saw, the embedded space in the middle, that is in variational autoencoders, that is a continuous model, right? So what the advantage of that is it is much easier to sample it. It's much easier to interpolate between different values. So instead, like the normal output of an autoencoder is a tensor, a vector, right? It's a matrix output. But in case of variational autoencoders, the output is not a vector, but it's not just a vector of like original values, but it's a vector of means and standard deviation. So it essentially gives you a Gaussian distribution, and that approximate posterior distribution Q of Z given X is the output of variational autoencoder, and you can sample from that output from that distribution to get an output. I know this is getting slightly technical. You don't need to understand like the full technical details of it because it's a fairly complex topic. There's very involved math behind this. But what I want you to understand is like the fundamental difference between an autoencoder and a variational autoencoder is this middle, right? So instead of a normal autoencoder essentially gives you a matrix that is just like an output image, right? A variational autoencoder gives you a distribution which you can sample to get an image. Right. So that is pretty much the difference. So what would it look like? So in the previous image that I showed you of an implementation, there was just this Z, right? In this case, to get that Z, what we have is mu and sigma, which is a mean and a standard deviation. So once you have the mean and standard deviation of a distribution, you can sample it to get an output. Right. So this is what the output. I'll stop after. So the model gives you the mu, which is the means of the different vectors, and then it gives you a standard deviation. So you take, once you have that, you convert it to a Gaussian distribution of sign 1 with that mean and that sigma, and then you sample, and then you can get the sample vector, which is more representative of a continuous distribution than a normal autoencoder. Okay. So to generate an autoencoder, there are lots of tricks in between. There's something called reparameterization and lots of other different things. I'll share this slide with you. So if you want to go into more depth, you can. But for this, okay. After this, let me show you an example of using an autoencoder to solve like an actual problem, which is we'll be using our autoencoder to get to do anomaly detection, essentially. Sorry? Anomaly detection, yes. Give me a sec to start up Jupyter Lab. Too many tabs. This will be short. We should be done in like 10 minutes and then you can all escape. Okay, so oops, that's the wrong one. This is so hard to give me a sec. No, okay. So, I'll be sitting for this one because it's way easier to sit and instead of doing this. Yes. Shift enter. So you can see that this is using TensorFlow. If this is not visible, let me zoom in. Wait, it doesn't control scroll, does not zoom in. Okay, can you read this at the back? Okay, that's cool. So this script essentially demonstrates how you can use a reconstruction convolutional autoencoder model to detect anomalies in this time series data that you can see here. So the data that I'm using is a benchmark data. It's called a Boltzmann brain data. It's I forgot the name of it. Some kind of anomaly benchmark. It's called an NAB data. So you should be able to find, if you Google it, you should be able to find it. So it provides artificial time series data containing labeled anonymous periods, essentially. The data is ordered, time-stamped, and single-valued matrix, right? So for your actual, so yeah, this is what it looks like. And once you plot it, to take a quick look at the data, to visualize the time series data without any anomalies, this is what it looks like. Right? You can see here, it's a very regular data, right? It's completely sinusoidal. It looks very regularized, etc., etc. But okay, now, well, if this is not the only thing it does, you also have, once you put in the anomalies, you can see that this is a major anomaly. So this is what you're trying to detect, right? For your actual data, the data set that you'll be using for your task 5, it will be Wikipedia traffic, like traffic to all Wikipedia pages between 2016 and 17 or 2017 and 18, something like that. It has 6 different languages, and all of you will be using different languages. We'll give you a method to choose a different language between them. So for whatever language you've been given, you have to implement essentially this to detect spikes of anomalous behavior within that data, essentially. So, okay, did I press Shift Enter? Yeah. So the total number of training samples is roughly 4,000. Once we have done that, we have to figure out how many time steps there are, which is essentially 288 time steps. We generate a training sequence for this, and we look at the training output shape, which is 3,000 something by 288, essentially. That's the dimension of your tensor, essentially. So next, we will build a convolutional reconstruction autoencoder model. This model will, can you see it? Okay, this is the model, essentially. So the model will take the input of shape, batch size, sequence length, and the total number of features. And it will return an output of the same shape. Right, has to be the output of the same shape because otherwise you can't compare. So in this case, the length of the sequence is 288, and the number of features is just 1, right? So you can understand why we are using autoencoders for this. So this is the autoencoder model. This should look familiar to you compared to what we just saw in the autoencoder training. So think of why an autoencoder is good for this. You have a very regular model, right? You saw this initial data, right? So this is a very regular, very symmetrical model. So if you train an autoencoder on this, it will generate something very similar to this. So once, if you give it this if you give it this data for testing, again, this will very easily stand out as anomalies. Now for the Wikipedia data, this won't be exactly like this. I'll show you what the Wikipedia data looks like. But yeah, so this is what your model looks like, right? So now we have to train the model, and note that. Wait, hang on. Let me. You can see it took me, well, my laptop has a i9, so the training didn't take very long. But in your system, it might take slightly longer because the Wikipedia dataset that will be giving you is just 550 rows. So it shouldn't take you much longer. Even if you don't have like a inbuilt GPU, your CPU should be able to handle like 550 training models. I'm sorry? It's just one. I mean, 550, it's a time series data with one feature. That's just whatever language you choose. Yeah, it should be fine. Yeah, like I said, this time series is this test is supposed, this assignment is supposed to be simple. It's dimensional reduction. Yeah. Okay, so you can see that obviously we have used early stopping here because otherwise we gave it 50 epochs. So it would, if we didn't, if we reach our standard of training, like if our accuracy reaches high enough, if our loss falls below a certain value, it will stop. If we didn't give early stopping, it would keep training over and over again. So just to show you what this training looks like. Oh, I didn't run the earlier models. Oops. I have no idea where I stopped running it from, but let's do this, this. So yeah, you can see that this is pretty quick and it won't go like all 50 epochs. It's going to stop by 17 or 18, I hope. Yes, see, it has already stopped. As soon as it falls below 0.025, the model building stops. So once we have trained the model, let's look at the training and validation loss, just to see what it looks like. You can see that it very obviously you saw the picture. It's a very symmetric, very sinusoidal thing. So the training is like is very simple. So it went very well. So next we'll try to detect anomalies by trying to determine how well our model can reconstruct this input data. So how do we do this? We find the MAE loss on the training samples. Then we find the maximum loss value. This is essentially the maximum loss value is, let me see if you see here. Yeah. So the maximum loss value is essentially the worst our model has performed trying to reconstruct a sample. So we will make this the threshold for anomaly detection because we need some form of threshold, because otherwise we can't really tell if something is going above or below, like whether it's an anomaly or not. So you guys have been doing outlier detection for your current task. So this is essentially a form of outlier detection. So we are creating the threshold. So if the reconstruction loss for a sample is greater than this threshold, then we infer that the model is seeing a pattern that it isn't that isn't within the autoencoder model, and then we'll label that sample as an anomaly. So run this. So yeah, you get the training losses essentially. So now you get the reconstruction error threshold thing. Yeah, the reconstruction error threshold you can find over here. And then we compare, we compare how well our autoencoder has performed, like how well has it reconstructed the first sample. So this is the 288 time step. So you can see the orange value is what it has reconstructed for the first day. And you can see that it has come pretty close, right? So next we prepare all the training data. Then we create this is essentially the data. Then we create the input shape, we create the sequences, then we train the model, we get the test MA score, and then these are all the values that the autoencoder has found that are anomalies, like all the values from within the data that are anomalies. Now we now know which of the samples within the original data are anomalies. With this, we can find the corresponding timestamp in the original data. So we'll be using that to find out, like, to plot which of the data sets are actual anomalies. Oh no. I may have missed one of them. I have no idea what the there. You can see that it is able to detect like this red part as the anomaly. So that's pretty much what you'll be doing, but your data set is going to look slightly different. Hang on. My head is hurting. So, oops. Let me see here. So this is the Wikipedia dataset that you'll be using. And this is you'll be picking based on your IDs. We'll give you a formula. You'll be picking one of these languages. This is like Wikipedia traffic data. So you'll be picking one of these languages and training your model on this, and then figuring out which of them are anomalies. And then we want like a couple of lines if you can figure out why there was an anomaly on that date, because the day will be given in the data set itself. So if you can try to figure out like what happened on that day that a million different people went to Wikipedia, it'll be pretty obvious. It's in November 2016. Yeah. So yeah, like I said, so this will be your data, and you'll be training your model on these things, on these different languages, and your autoencoder will be able to detect which of these is the anomalies. So yeah, that's it for me. Sorry, I may have gone a little bit late, but if you have any questions, I'll DM me on Teams. I'll share all of these. I'll share the code. I'll share the slides on Teams. So if you have any questions, come to me. This is a fairly complex topic, and if you're interested, I'm very willing to help. All right, thank you. Sorry, I don't have treats today.